Okay, now let's talk about chapter 14. Covers the interaction of parasites and hosts. This chapter starts with this interesting uh, situation that you sometimes see with parasites, what are called enslaver parasites. They're ones that modify the behavior of the host such that that changed behavior facilitates dispersal of the parasite. We're given this example of these flies that are infected with a fungus that um, shortly before the flies die, they perch underneath the leaves of plants on the downwind side, the wind coming from the left here, and then the fly essentially gets sort of just sitting there, and now it has died, but it's attached to the leaf. And now the fungus completes its life cycle and begins to distribute or release spores, and they blow down from the plant with the wind, and any other healthy flies that happen to be downwind from there can get infected with those spores, thus perpetuating the fungus. There's a type of pathogen that causes small mammals to lose their fear of the predators who might want to eat them, and they don't necessarily run and hide when they should, and that causes them to be eaten, which helps to complete the life cycle of that parasite. So, a parasite host relationship is an example of a symbiosis, which is essentially a very close relationship between two species. And a symbiosis can include a mutualism, which is a mutually beneficial relationship, but again, it can also include parasite host, which is a relationship in which one benefits the parasite and the host is negatively affected. So, a parasite is an organism that essentially lives in or on another one and basically derives a nutrition from them and uses that host to also, in some part, complete its life cycle. Um, so any organism can have a parasite, and I'm sure just about every organism does have many parasites. Here are just a few examples of some human parasites, um, ones that live on us, like lice, and ones that live in us, like certain types of worms or fungi or bacteria. Um, so essentially, an organism, our bodies, for example, provide a very good habitat for things that would like to parasitize us. Um, Parasites tend to be fairly host specific. That is, Mycobacterium tuberculosis, which is what gives us tuberculosis, is pretty specific to us. Um, Now, sometimes, though, a parasite will use multiple hosts, though, to complete its life cycle, although often it really only is damaging to one of those hosts. For example, um, the Plasmodium, which is a type of protozoan that causes malaria, spends part of its life cycle in a mosquito and part in a person, but it's much more damaging to the person, to the human, than it is to the mosquito. But it needs both to complete its life cycle. Of course, organisms can have multiple parasites, and here you can see with mammals, on average, they have around 14, 15 parasites. That is the typical mammal will, and birds with around 6 or 7. You can see plants have a whole lot of potential parasites. Now, hopefully, with our advances in sanitation, hygiene, and such, we have relatively few, if any, but we've all had illnesses before and so have experienced uh, parasites. Um, Parasites can live on us or in us. If they're on us, it's known as an ectoparasite, and in people, that would be a body louse, for example, or a tick or a leech. Here's some examples with plants. This is mistletoe here on the right, which is a photosynthetic plant, but yet it lives on and taps into the nutrients of its host plant, the trees. Here on the left, we have one called dodder, Dodder, and it's interesting in that it is a non-photosynthetic plant that parasitizes other plants. And so the one being parasitized is this green stem in the middle, and the sort of yellowish thing wrapped around it is dodder, and this is a cluster of the flowers from the dodder plant. So it's a flowering plant, but it doesn't photosynthesize and just parasitizes other plants. Other ectoparasites, corn smut, and here are these mites. There's an individual one that essentially are sort of sucking juices out of this caterpillar that they're parasitizing. Ectoparasites. Endoparasites live inside their host, and the tapeworm being a classic example in mammals. Here's Mycobacterium tuberculosis, this bacterium that gets in our lungs and resides there and causes all sorts of havoc. This one I believe is a fungus that infects potatoes and causes them to rot. Endoparasites. So the life of a parasite is not all glory. There are some hazards to it. But let's compare ecto and endoparasites. So ectoparasites, they're on the outside, so it's easier for them to disperse, and they don't have to deal so much with the host's immune system. Disadvantages, though, of course, you're more vulnerable to things seeing you and picking you off, your enemies, if you will. And when animals, say, groom themselves or each other, they can pick off these ectoparasites. You're exposed to the internal environment. And you have to find a way to be attached to this organism but feed on it. And so you have to have some feeding mechanism, some mouth structure that allows you to penetrate the skin, if you will, of this organism to feed on it. Endoparasites, internal parasites advantage, well, once you're inside, it's fairly easy. You're surrounded by food, you might say. You don't have to deal with the external environment and the enemies that might be out there. However, you do have to deal with the immune system of the host, and you have to find a way to get your progeny out or to spread others of your kind from that host. So, for example, a tapeworm, which is an endoparasite of mammals, lives in the gut and feeds off the food that the animal has eaten. It has to release its eggs through the feces of the host, and then those eggs have to find their way into the next host to propagate the next generation of tapeworms. And so that can be a challenge for them. All right, now let's move on to section 2, see how far we get. So hosts have ways of defending themselves against parasites, and parasites have ways of attempting to overcome the defenses of a host. Now, first of all, most basically, a host will have some kind of protective covering. Our skin, for example, is pretty good at keeping particularly endoparasites out. And others have exoskeletons, hard shells, and whatnot to keep those parasites out. Vertebrates, in particular, animals with backbones, have a relatively complex immune system that is there to deal with and destroy foreign objects, foreign organisms, pathogens that get into us. So if there's a break in the skin and some bacterium, some pathogen gets in, it has what we would call antigens, which are proteins on it that are recognized by our system as being foreign. We have a type of white blood cell, these things are called macrophages, and their job is to roam around and find these foreign objects. Once they have, what they do is they essentially tell the rest of the immune system, I found something foreign, something unique. In particular, it takes those proteins, those antigens from the pathogen, and essentially presents them to these other white blood cells, things called T cells, and then B cells. And their job is to take that antigen, and particularly the B cells do this. They produce antibodies, and these are proteins that circulate around our bloodstream and our lymphatic system. And these antibodies essentially target the foreign object and its antigens and label it for destruction. Um, so essentially, you get exposed to something, you recognize that exposure, you produce a bunch of these antibodies, and your immune system ideally deals with that foreign object, that pathogen inside of you. Um, Biochemical defenses, so things not related to the immune system, but that are there to help fight and ward off pathogens. Um, so, for example, in us, as you know, inside of our bloodstream, our hemoglobin in particular, we have iron present. Well, this is something that a bacterial infection needs. They need this iron to help them do their thing. Well, we have an adaptation that basically lowers the iron content of our blood during an infection to essentially starve the bacteria of what they need to complete their life cycle. Um, Now, the book mentions how, on the other side of the coin, the bacteria have ways of attempting to get at the iron that we do have in our bloodstream to try to get around this adaptation. Plants, plant cells that are damaged by a bacterial infection, produce these compounds called phytolexins, and the phytolexins themselves attempt to ward off the pathogen. They also spread to adjacent plant cells and essentially are, quote, telling that plant cell that there is a problem in an adjacent cell, and so that cell will produce this material called lignin, which solidifies and sort of blocks off the cell walls and attempts to keep that bacterium from spreading to other cells. So it kind of isolates the infected cell, and they sort of say, okay, that cell's done for, but let's keep the other cells from being infected. That was lignin, Lignin. So indeed, biochemical defenses can be used. Here's an interesting example as well. So we have mutualistic symbionts that live inside us, bacteria that live in our gut and such. And when there is an infection, these symbionts we have can become part of the process of attempting to battle that pathogen. So essentially, the beneficial microbes that live inside us join in battling the pathogen. Excuse me. Now, does it make sense to you why it would be to their benefit to do this? After all, they live inside us and depend on us in this mutualistic relationship. So, of course, if this pathogen comes along and kills us, then that's going to do the same to them. They're going to lose their home. So you can see how um, the evolutionary process will favor these symbionts that essentially can help their host or help their mutualistic host to battle this pathogen. Here's an example with some aphids, and aphids are these, they themselves are parasites because they basically suck the juices um, out of plants, but they have pathogens that attempt to attack them as well. Um, but they have a symbiotic um, bacterium that lives inside them. And when presented, in particular, it was a type of fungus that attacks the aphids. When the aphids have their beneficial symbiont inside of them present, you can see their survival is much greater than when the symbiont is absent.